Hello, my name is Ryan from Buster Beagle 3D, and today I'm going to give a little crash course in Lightburn for the xTool D1 Pro, which also applies to the original D1. You may have seen my video going over xTool Creative Space, which is a free program that xTool provides to control the laser, but I get many requests to do the same thing for Lightburn, so here it is. I'll try to break this up into chapters that you can scroll through in the timeline in YouTube if you ever need to reference anything or want to skip to a particular section that interests you. I will not go over every single thing in Lightburn, but hit the things that might be of most interest to you and others out there. So let's get started. So the first thing that I kind of want to talk about is what Lightburn cannot do. And the reason I want to bring this up is because the xTool D1 is not what you would call an open source machine. And what that means is that you don't have control over every single parameter because some of that stuff is locked by the company in the firmware. So there are certain settings that you're not going to be able to change in Lightburn, but there are some of those settings that you can change in Creative Space. So even if you're going to be using Lightburn, you still want to install xTool Creative Space. So I'm going to open that right now. And xTool Creative Space is the free version of a software that you can use for the machine. Again, you can reference my video that I did on a beta version of that software. Some things might have changed by now, but it should still be a pretty good reference. So when we first open that up and you connect your machine to it, if you come over to this little gear icon, the first thing that you can do in here is check for updates. So you can check to see if there's any firmware updates for the machine and then update the firmware directly through the software. And then the other thing that you can do in here is change some of these working parameters. Now, whatever you change in here will already automatically work in Lightburn. So the first thing is the positioning mode. If you notice, there's that laser crosshair off to the side of your laser. Now, what that is doing is that's placing a crosshair over 16 millimeters, and then when it goes to frame everything, the laser will move over to that spot and then basically tell you where your laser is going to burn based on that crosshair. I'm not a huge fan of that for two reasons. One, there's the ability for something to not be correct. You know, as you can see, there's this red cross offset. That means that they know that that offset might be, slightly off from that 16 millimeters. So this is giving you the ability to adjust that. And the other thing is that if you use the red crosshairs, you can't ever achieve the full workable advertised area of the D1. You can even see it here. So if you look up in this top corner, if I hit laser spot, you'll see that the grid behind me got a little bit larger. And that's because if you're using the laser spot, you can actually get to every single corner of the advertised work area. So just by default, I'd rather be using the laser spot so I know exactly where that laser is going to be. Okay, and then moving down here we have the flame alarm. So we have highly sensitive, low sensitivity, and do not show again, which is turning the flame alarm off. And the reason you might want to mess with this, basically this is here if there's a fire or if it detects a flame, but sometimes it's a little bit too sensitive, so you can either choose low sensitivity, so the alarm will only go off if there truly is a flame. But if you use the machine like I do sometimes outdoors, the sun can also potentially set that off. So you can also turn it off if you don't want to use it anymore. And then this stop when moved, this is if there's any type of bumping of the machine to where you'll get an error, so you can turn that off if you really want to. And then the last thing here is the limit switches. Now, if you have the original D1, there are no limit switches, but on the D1 Pro, there are limit switches. And really all that this is going to do is turn off the alarm if it is going to go out of the workable area. So this will not affect any type of homing position for homing your laser or using absolute coordinates. It has been my experience that if you have your limit switches turned on, the laser cannot really reach the full advertised area of the D1. So especially if I'm using like my grid, for instance, I turn this off so that I can reach the full extent of that grid area. And again, this will not affect any of the homing function of the laser. So again, these are only things that can be adjusted in xTool Creative Space. And then once you migrate over to Lightburn, all of these settings will carry over. Okay, so the next thing that you're going to want to do is go to xtool.com, and we are going to get some things for Lightburn. So if we come over to support, and then under product guide, we have for D1 Pro or for D1. So I'm doing this for the Pro, so I will select that. And then under the quick start guide, we have this use Lightburn to operate the D1 Pro. And I'm going to click on that. Now, the first thing that you'll see in here is a link to Lightburn. So if we were to click that, Lightburn is not a free piece of software. I believe it's around $60. It's a really powerful tool. It can be used for multiple lasers. It has a lot of nice features that you might not be able to utilize in xTool Creative Space. But there also is a 30-day trial that you can use. It's a fully usable version for that 30 days where you can kind of test it out, see if you like it. And then after that time period, again, it's $60, which is really reasonable for the amount of stuff that you get with this software package. So you can download the version that you need. And then start using the program. Now if I go back to the Use Lightburn page, the next thing under there is this xTool D1 Pro version 3 Lightburn dev file. And what this is a basically a configuration file that the company has already provided for you that is going to help you set up the laser in Lightburn with a lot of the settings that you already need. So all you need to do is click on that. It'll download it for you. And then we can open up Lightburn and start. Now, just real quick on this page, there's also some information here about how to do, first of all, how to import that configuration file, and then just some very, very basic information having to do with Lightburn and to use different parts with it. So you can always check that out for a general reference guide. Okay, so when we're back in Lightburn, the first thing that you're going to want to do is come over here to Devices, and you're going to click on Devices, and then this will be all your list of devices. You can see I have a couple of lasers on there so far, and again, Lightburn works with quite a variety of different lasers. So the first thing we want to do is click that Devices, which opens this, and we're going to click on Import. And then I'm going to find that xTool D1 Pro file. I'm going to click on it and hit Open. And you'll see that it is generated an xTool D1 Pro device already with all of the settings already in there. And so I just click OK. Now, if you don't have any other lasers, this down here will automatically change to that D1 Pro. But since I have a couple different lasers, I just need to go and pick it. And you'll see that my laser is still listed as disconnected right here. And that's because I need to choose the proper USB path. Now that brings up another thing that I just want to quickly talk about, is that when you're using Lightburn, you cannot use the Wi-Fi functionality of the D1 or the D1 Pro. Lightburn will allow you to use Wi-Fi with other devices, but again, since this is not an open source machine, that is not something that, as of the time of this video, is not a supported feature of the D1. So you have to have it connected through the USB anytime you want to use Lightburn. And so mine is not connected to COM1, but it's connected to COM4. And now you'll see that it says that it is ready and we are ready to use it. Now, a couple of things that I want to hit just real quick before I dive too deep into this is I want to come up here where it says device settings, and I'm going to click on device settings, and you can also get that through edit and device settings. So it brings up this window, and you'll see that I have the working size here, and it's showing it in millimeters, 430 by 400 millimeters, which is correct. Now, if depending on the version of the D1 Pro that you have, whether you have the 20 watt, the 10 watt, or the 5 watt, this number is actually a little bit different. So it's off by a little bit, but for right now I'm just going to leave it. But just be aware that if you have the 20 watt, your the actual workable area is a little bit smaller than this. And then we have the origin. So the origin is showing that the home position is in the top left corner, which is correct. And now this is what I really want to direct you to here, and this is that laser offset. Now again, the laser, when you're using the crosshairs, has a negative 16 millimeter position on the X. Well, because I've already turned that off because I don't want to use that laser offset anymore, I either need to set that to 0 or just disable this. So that's a way of telling Lightburn, hey, I'm not using that laser offset anymore, just by turning that off. The other thing that I like to do in here is I like to have the laser on when framing. So whenever I'm doing something where I want to see where my job is going to burn, I want to turn on that laser while framing. Okay, so I'm just going to click OK. Now the other thing that I'm going to do in here is I'm going to come up to General Lightburn Settings. So this was already clicked on mine, so you may or may not see this, but if you have the rotary tool and you want to be able to see whether you want to enable or disable that in your main laser window down here, you can either turn this off and then that will disappear down here, or we can turn that back on and hit OK and it'll show up. Now the other thing that I like to do personally in here is I like to use millimeters per minute. I mean, this is where you can also change it to inches or whatever else you want to use. Even though I'm in the US, I like to do all of my laser engraving, my 3D printing, CNC. I do all of that in millimeters, and I like to use millimeters per minute. Now if you want to mirror what is being done in xTool Creative Space, they use millimeters per second. But it's just a personal preference, however you want your grid units to be displayed. So I'm going to keep that millimeters per minute, hit OK. Okay, so now I'm going to do a quick rundown of kind of what everything is as far as where it is in the UI, and then I'll go a little bit more in depth about what each of the components actually does. So starting first, just across the shelf, across the top, we have our new, our open, our save, our import, and if you hover over any of these buttons, you'll see that it will tell you what it is. We have undo and redo, copy, cut, paste, delete, pan. If you click on this, you can drag your window around. You can also click on the zoom to page if you ever need to go back to whatever it is that you were working on. You can zoom in, zoom out. You can also do this with the middle mouse button. This button right here on the top is a select button. So if you ever want to deselect one of these things, that's how you would do that. You can also middle mouse to drag around. If something ever gets kind of moved off and you don't know where your canvas is anymore, you can also click on this zoom and that'll put it back into frame for you. This little camera icon is for lasers that have a camera setup where you can orient things based on the laser. There are some aftermarket things that you can do for the D1 that you can get on Etsy, but it's not something that's native to the machine. Right next to that is a preview window. So if you have something in your scene and you want to see what it's going to do, you can click on that preview and it'll show you what the laser is going to do. It does exactly what it says it is. It's a preview. And then this was the general settings that we went through, the device settings. We have a group and ungroup selected objects. So that's, if I had two of these things and I shift selected both of them, I could group them. So now they're one selection. I could ungroup them. So now they are two separate selections. And then we have some mirror selection tools up here, or mirroring of the objects. And then we have a bunch of alignment tools, which is what all of these are up here. And you guys can try those out and kind of see how those work. Okay, now going down the left-hand side here, again, we have the select button. So this is for when you have something in your scene. If I drew a bunch of things, you can just go in and you can select each one of those objects individually, or shift select to select multiple objects. Obviously we have a pen tool where you can either do it with a Bezier curve if you click and then drag, or if you just click a point and click another point, it'll be more of a linear type of drawing. Now another thing that you can do when you're doing this is if you select one point and then you hit shift, then it'll lock it into these different degrees. I believe this is just doing it in 45-degree increments. And then, obviously we have square, circle. This will create shapes. So under that we have something where we can edit the different nodes. So let's say I drew out a design, and then I can select that and start to pick and pull different spots and do different things with those lines. So it's just another way of playing with these with this vector graphic. The one below it is a tab maker. So let's say I have a line that I have around here, and I have it set to line over here. I'll go over these cuts and layers later. But if I select this add tabs, I can select different points on this, what would be a cut line, and just kind of place those around. And the reason you would do this is if you never want the object that you are cutting out to fully detach from the piece that you're cutting it out from. So if I go into my preview and you zoom way in, you'll see that there's little gaps between those cuts. And that's really just so that those pieces would stay together even after they had been cut out. Under that, obviously, we have text. So you can add any type of text. You can also change your font up here. You can select your text and then change the fonts, change the size, just any type of different font generation you have in other programs. It's very similar in here. If you want to set the laser to a certain location, you can click on this and then click anywhere on your grid. You just want to be careful that you have already homed your position so that the laser, if it thinks it's in the top left corner, it's actually there, because if you click on something over here and the laser is right in the center, it's just going to bang into your frame if you have those limit switches turned off. And then we have some measuring tools. So if you draw a line, you can either hover over points and it'll tell you how long those points are, its location. You can even have two different objects Let's say I wanted to know the distance between these two. You can also click and then kind of snap and drag between those two. So you can see the length of the segment, the angle that those are apart from each other. So it's just a way of kind of understanding the different measurements. So down here we have this offset shape. So if you click on this, it'll bring up this little window, and you'll see that it has generated this new kind of lines around this box that I had. And all of it's pretty self-explanatory. We have where you can do outward, inward, or both. You can change the corner style of what it's generating. You can delete your original shape. You can change the height that it was at. So just a different way of kind of potentially creating an outline around a shape or something else that you're working with that you might want to cut out or something like that. So that's what that one does. Okay. And then we have a bunch of different combine tools. So the way these work is whatever you select as your second object is the one that it's going to use to apply whatever these settings are. So you can select multiple objects and you can weld all the objects together. So if I select this and select this one by clicking shift and I select that, then it'll create it into one object. I'm doing Control Z to undo. The next one would be again for two objects. You can use the first one for multiple objects. So I select those and it'll combine those again. If you wanted to cut out this square from this square, then actually it's the second. I have to select it second, and then it'll cut it out. You can also, let's say I wanted this shape. Oops. Say I wanted this shape, and I just wanted this inner piece. You select the first one, select the second one, and where they overlap, that'll be the piece that you're left with. So all very self-explanatory things. We have an array. So if you wanted to make multiple versions of something, you can click this little array button, and then you can start to make a grid of these different sections. And of course, you have a lot of controls over like how far those are going to be spaced apart from each other, where they're going to be located, how many you have. Again, pretty self-explanatory. And you can also do the same thing, but do it in a radial pattern. So I can select the object, and then you can start to make some cool patterns, or you can start to have them offset from each other. And I'm just moving where the center of this pattern is. So just a way to make neat shapes. I don't know exactly what this would be useful for, but maybe you do, but that's how you would do it. So the button underneath that is, let's say for whatever reason you wanted to control the direction that your object is cutting out or burning or engraving or whatever. You can tell it where you want it to start. So if you click this button here, you can click on any of these corners, and that is where your part will start to cut from. So it'll start from that and then go around. That's what that does. And then the last thing here is a radius. So you set your radius first, and then you just click on any point, and it'll apply that radius that you've determined down here to that to the point that you choose. So that's for smoothing out edges or smoothing or rounding corners and things like that. Okay. So that's everything kind of down this line. Now again, for this particular machine, I'm not going to be using the camera control, so I can just close that. And the other thing that I wanted to kind of bring up, let's say you've accidentally kind of moved this stuff off. You've kind of accidentally moved this stuff around. You close things that you didn't mean to, and then you're like, oh, great, how do I get all that stuff back? If you want to go back to how it was when you first started, you can just come up here to Window and reset to default layout, and then it'll put all that stuff back in there for you. There's other things that you can add into here, but if you just want the default ones that come with Lightburn, you can just say reset to default layout. Okay, so now what I want to go over are these sections on the right here. So we have cuts and layers, move, and console. So I'm going to start with the cuts and layers, and this is really one of the nicest parts about Lightburn, and what this is going to do is allow me to run different operations on different pieces. And so what I mean by that is, let's say I have a box and I want to cut this box out, but then I also have some text. So let's say I have some text, and then I'm going to import an image. Okay. Now, when we're looking at the right here, we'll see that we have line and we have image. So an image can only have a mode of an image, but anything that is a vector graphic can either do the line, fill, or offset. But one of the nice things that we can do here is we can pick a different operation for each of these. So if you look at the bottom, you'll see all of these different squares down here. And each one of these can correspond to a different layer. So let's say I have this thing that says write something, and I want to have a different operation for that. I can just select the vector graphic and then select the box down here. But let's say for this one I wanted to cut it out in a piece of wood. So I can leave that number 2 as a line, and let's just say my speed on that would be 100 millimeters per minute, and I'm going to just say 100% power. So right now what's going to happen is when it goes to burn the laser, it's first going to try to cut this square out. Then it's going to fill in my image, because that is the second thing in the operation. And then the third thing would be this write something. Well, that doesn't really make any sense. You never want to cut something out before you engrave on something. So the order of this matters. So what you can do is you can change the order in which these operations happen. So let's say the first thing I want would be the image to engrave. So I can click on this and I can either drag it up to the top, or I can select it and then use these arrow keys to go up and down. So let's say I start off with the image, and then the next thing that I want is the write something, because I'm still engraving at this point, and I'm going to do that as a fill. So then I'll select this, move that up to the top, and then the very last thing would be this line where I'm cutting something out. Now if you don't know exactly which part is which, you can also right click on the layer and it'll flash in your work area. So that's just a nice quick way to see which part belongs to which operation. It's really useful when you have a lot of images too, because those aren't changing colors like the vector graphics are. So it's super powerful that you can see that. And you can change these at any time too. So if you wanted to select this and you wanted to change it to a different color with a different operation, you can do that as well. You can select multiple objects by holding down Shift and clicking them, and then change that to a completely different operation. So any of these again can have different parameters. They can have different settings. You can do different things, and it's really nice to just have them all in a list. And again, it'll work in the order that you have them here from top to bottom. Now, the other thing that we have in here is output, show, and air. So what output means, if this little checkbox is checked, it's going to send that process to the laser. So if you didn't want something to be sent to the laser, you just uncheck output and it'll skip it when it goes through all of its programming. Now, the show is just for your environment here. It has nothing to do with what gets sent and not sent to the laser. So it's just for making things easier. So like if I turned off this image and so I don't see it anymore, it's still being sent to the laser because output is turned on. So just be careful if you're hiding and unhiding things, that it really doesn't matter. It really matters what is being shown in your output. And now the last thing is air. And what this is for is it's a way of the program to send a signal to your laser whether or not it wants the air assist turned on or off. Now natively there is no way to tell the D1 or the D1 Pro that you want your air assist on or off. I know there are some aftermarket things that do that, and I'll put one up at the link above that may do that for you. But that's what this little checkbox is doing. If you don't have an aftermarket thing to adjust the air assist, then this will do nothing. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to the Move tool. So it's just the tab right next to the cuts and layers. So in here we have a couple of different things. This will allow us to move the laser through the program, left or right. The little home button in there will send the laser all the way up to the home position, which again is at the top left. And you can change the distance, the speed of what these buttons will do. Now when you've homed your machine or you've homed your laser, you can go to a specific position with that laser. So let's say you've homed your laser, and I'm going to select all of this, and I want this to go to the 200 by 200 position. Okay, and let's say that I wanted my laser to also go to wherever that 200 by 200 position is, in the real world on my laser. I could just manually type in 200 by 200 and then go, and then the laser will move right to that spot in relation to in the relation to my piece. And then under here where it says power and it says fire, I believe by default this is set to 10%. And what this is going to do is when you hit fire, it will turn on your physical laser. So that is also the setting that is going to be used if you're doing any type of framing of your piece that you're working on. So I would suggest potentially lowering this to that 5%. Because you don't really want to burn anything at that point. You're really just wanting to be able to see where the laser is going to be, and even at that 5%, you still want to put on your safety glasses because you could still damage your eyes from that. But this would be how you test fire your laser to see where the positioning is. Okay. And then the last tab in here is just the console. So this is just going to tell you everything that's happening with the laser currently. Because this machine runs off of G-code, you can also type in G-code commands here if you know them, and then it'll do whatever you want it to do to your laser at that point. Okay, so under here we now have the laser controls. So you have your pause, stop. Start is what you're going to click on when you want to send your job to the laser. And then framing is what you always want to do before you run your job, and again that's just going to draw an outline around the piece that you're working on. So you know, if it was homed and it was 200 millimeters away and 300 millimeters down, it's just going to trace around that image so that before I burn, I know exactly where the laser is going to move during that entire operation that I'm working on. Okay. We don't have to really worry about save G-code or run G-code because there's no offline controller for this machine. Again, we have our home button, which will just move everything to the top left corner. I'm not sure if the original D1 will do anything when you click the home button because it does not have limit switches. But for the D1 Pro, which does have limit switches, you can hit the home button, which will go to that spot. You can also, in this move, you can set an origin. So if you manually move it to a spot and then you hit set origin, you can go back to that origin at any point by clicking this button. Okay, and so the last thing that I'm going to go over here is the start from. So right now I have this set to absolute coordinates, and I'll go over how I successfully use that in just a moment. But what absolute coordinates is it means that you've homed your laser, it goes all the way to the home position, which is in the top left corner, and then it's going to respect where I place things in my workable area. So if this was moved up to this section over here, and I put a piece of wood exactly at that spot, the laser is going to start from 0 and then it's going to come over to exactly where this is in relation to this grid and then start to burn something. And really the only way that you can utilize this successfully is if you burn a grid, which I'll show in just a second. And then the next one would be current position. And now current position works pretty much the exact same way that xTool Creative Space works. And what that means is you manually move your laser to a spot somewhere in your workable area. So this little green dot is where the program thinks that your laser currently is. So it doesn't really matter where you put this in your workable area, because it's going to assume that wherever this piece of wood or material that you're working on, it's going to assume that you've already placed this laser in the top left corner. And again, you can use these job origin dots down here to change from which position you're telling it that the laser is at. And then you can also, of course, do that user origin that I was talking about, where you've set an origin somewhere. So you've moved the laser, you've set the origin, and it'll burn in relation to where it says that your user origin is. Okay. All right. So now I want to go over a little bit more about how to use this absolute coordinates. Now, really the only way to use absolute coordinates is if you burn a grid onto a spoil board and then you also have that laser somehow attached down to that spoil board so that it can never move. So once you burn the grid, you can start to place objects on that grid and they'll never deviate from where you have that. So I've generated some grids. So let me open one. Okay, so this is one of the grids for the D1 20 watt with the RA2 Pro. So this would be something that I would burn down to my spoil board, and all of these settings correspond to settings in Lightburn. So you see that this 210 is right where this X210 is, and then this Y200 is exactly where this Y200 is. So even if this grid wasn't displayed here, all of the coordinates still match. And so that way, if I was to import an image, so like that Mount Rushmore image, and let's say I placed a piece of wood where the bottom corner was exactly at this 210 Y200, then I could move this image to that location. So that would be X 210 and Y 200. So even if I didn't have that grid visible or in here at all, I can still home my laser so that it goes to this corner and then place my piece of wood exactly where this is, and then with absolute coordinates hit start. The laser is going to know exactly where it needs to go, and it's going to burn that image in that exact spot. The other nice thing that a laser grid does is that it allows you to square your pieces to the laser itself. Because if you had a piece of wood in here, you know, and you didn't have a grid to align it to, you know, maybe your piece of wood is like this, but you think that it's straight, but it's not really. I mean, this is an exaggeration, but you know, like even something like this, you think that this piece of wood is square to your laser, but it's not. So it's just a really good way, even if you weren't using absolute coordinates, to line your pieces up so that they're perfectly square with the laser. And I won't go too much more into this grid, which I'll put a link in the description if it's something that you're interested and you want to pick up. I also have versions for the 5 and 10 watt, because again they're a slightly different size. And then this is the RA2 Pro version, and what that has to do is these lines here. And each one of these lines corresponds to a placement on that rotary attachment. So again, I'll post another video that goes a little bit deeper into this, but I just kind of wanted to mention it in this Lightburn video as a useful part of using absolute coordinates. And the last thing that I want to talk about, which I didn't go too far into in the video about this grid, is again, you want to go into the xTool creative space and you want to make sure you're turning off your limit switches. You want to make sure that you're not using that crosshair, because again, it doesn't allow you to get to the full extent of the workable area. You also want to make sure that in the settings you have that laser offset turned off once you turn off those laser crosshairs. It's something I don't mention in that other video, but it is in the instructions in the file, but I just wanted to mention that for anyone who's picking that up. So now I wanted to talk about this little section right here that's grayed out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import an image and then kind of talk about these sizes up here. So to import an image, I can either click on this import button here, or I can go to File, Import, and I'm just going to import this Mount Rushmore image. Now, once you have something in your scene, so Lightburn can kind of handle two types of files. One is a raster file, which is just a regular image, and the other thing is a vector file. So the vector file would be an SVG that you either generate in here or you generate it in something like Illustrator, and what that is more line data. So so it's not an image per se. It's more of what's called vector, and what a vector is no matter how big I scale, you know, this image to, it's never going to lose quality, because it's really math. It's not like a line drawing like something like an image. There's no resolution to it. It's just a line to cut from. So when I have a raster image in here, or just, you know, like a JPEG or a PNG or something like that, I can select any of these corners and I can scale it. I can select the middle and move it around. And again, I'm clicking on this select tool over here to be able to do that. So up here where it says X position and Y position, if you look at this, this is telling me the position where this is in my workable area, but it's telling me where the center is, because if you look over here at these 9 dots, whatever you choose here in relation to your image, that's what it's going to give you this value of. So if you see, if I select the top here, you see this X and Y position change, and it changes every time I select a different spot. And that's because I'm saying from now, since it's in the top left corner, I'm saying this top left corner is at X 87.4 and Y 86.7. Now let's say I wanted to put this right at 100 by 100. Then I can just come up here, change that to 100, and change this to 100. Now the top left corner, which I'm showing in these circles right here, is at 100 by 100. If I was to choose any of the other dots, they would be at different locations. But it's just a way of kind of picking the pivot point that you're going to be working from. So now we can also scale this image. So let's say that I know that I only want this to be 200 millimeters wide, so that it was only going from 100 to 300. I can come up here and I can change that width to 200, and it'll still respect where I'm saying I wanted it scaled from, which is that top left corner. If you uncheck this little lock, then you can start to scale things, in not a uniform way, if you ever wanted to do that. So that's how you would do that. Okay. You can also do that by percentages here. So if you know you want it to be 200% of what it was, you can do that as well. Just Control-Z to undo that. You can also rotate it directly from here. So if I wanted to do the rotate, then at 90 degrees. And again, when you're using this, I just undid it, but when you use this rotate, it's going to rotate it from that top left corner. So if I wanted to rotate it 90, it's rotating it from where that top left corner was. Now, after I've rotated, the top left corner is now here. So if I was to do negative 90, it would do negative 90 from this spot. But if I wanted to rotate it back from this spot, then I come select this, which is now the top right, and then do a negative 90, and then it'll go back to where it was. So it's very important to keep in mind which is the pivot point that you are working on all of this stuff from. Okay, so before I even go into how to actually burn this image, I want to bring up a point of what you really want to do before you do any type of burning is you want to run a power speed test on the material that you want to use to burn your image onto. So if you check out the official xTool Facebook group, and then you go into the file section, if you just search for speed, you'll see that you have all of these different power speed tests that there's a member named Kobe Schmidt made, and he was very nice to put them all on this site for us. And what these do is it's going to give you a kind of a grid pattern that you can use to test your material. So I'm just going to open one of those right now. So you'll see these just open directly into Lightburn. I know he also has some for xTool Creative Space. But what it's going to do is it's going to, at 24,000 millimeters per minute, it's going to burn it at anywhere from 10 to 100% laser power. And the reason you want to do something like this is because you don't want to just be wasting material trying to find the proper settings for whatever it is that you want to do. Especially if you're doing like a big long image, you don't want to spend hours working on an image only to realize that you have the improper settings. So there's a bunch of different versions of these types of tests, and I would highly recommend finding one for the type of material that you're using, as well as like the speeds that you want to use. And you can just use these straight out of the box. You just want to go to File, Open, and open these and not change anything, and then just use them as is. Now, if you don't see one in there that you like, there is a website where I'm assuming some of those were generated from, where you can create your own power speed tests. And they also have, advanced versions. There's some engraving power tests where it'll use some images, different types of engraving and cutting. So you can use this online generator and generate your own. And I'll put a link to this in the description if that's something that you ever want to use. But I highly recommend doing your power speed tests. You can look to see what other people have done for a general idea of power and speed. But until you're using your laser with your type of wood in your type of environment or humidity or whatever, you really want to test out your materials so that you're just not wasting a lot. So after the power speed test, I'm going to go over again how to burn an image. So I'm going to open up, or I'm going to import that Mount Rushmore image back in. Okay. All right. So now I have this image and I want to burn it onto a piece of wood using whatever is the settings of the laser. So once it's in here, you'll see that it has added it to my cuts and layers, and the only mode that it's allowing me to do is image. And the reason for that is because that's really the only thing this can do. It's a raster image, so it's just going to go line by line by line from the bottom to the top, and it's going to burn this onto something that we're working on. So we have our mode, we have our power and our speed. So down here we can change the speed, and again mine is in millimeters per minute, and I'm not going to give any powers or speed, so don't pay attention to these. I'm just showing you that they exist. Again, you want to run your power speed tests on your particular material to know exactly what that's supposed to be. And you can also change the pass count here. Now if you want to get a little bit more in depth into what this is going to be doing, you can double click on your layer, and that's going to bring up your cut settings for this image. Again, we still have the power and the speed up here. And then the next thing I want to talk about is this line interval down here. Now, depending on which version of the laser you have, this line interval might be different. And the reason for that is the laser spot. So if I'm looking at the specs here, you'll see that I have my 20 watt, my 10 watt, and my 5 watt. And then you'll see that all of these laser spots are slightly different. And the reason is that the 20 watt has the largest laser spot out of the three, and then of course the 5 watt has the smallest laser spot. And this has nothing to do with power. This has to do with how big that dot is when it's working. So really, to get the finest detail possible, you want the smallest dot. Now obviously the 20 watt laser is far more powerful, and that's really because it's using 4 different 5 watt lasers to generate that 20 watts. But they're not aligned directly on top of each other. So that's what accounts for the larger laser spot. So if you look at this second number here, this is 0.1, this is 0.06, and then this is also 0.06. What you want to do, this is the height of that laser spot. So when you come back into here, you'll see that this line interval is 0.1. So the dots per inch that I can use with my laser is 254. So this is really the highest resolution that I should really try to do with my particular laser, because as the laser goes back and forth, if you start to get those too close to each other, they're going to start to overlap, because there's not going to be any gap between the different back and forth layers of that laser spot. Now, if I was using the 5 or 10 watt version, I know it says 0.06. I think that might be a little bit aggressive. So I would probably recommend 0.08, and then you'll see that it changes it to 318 dpi, which is what I would recommend for both the 5 and 10 watt versions of the machine. But again, I have the 20 watt, so I'll keep that at 1 or 0.1. Okay. So the next thing is this image mode. So when it's burning the image, it's going to process that image with what is called dithering. And what dithering is it's going to basically convert that into tiny little dots. And then based on, you know, if there's a really dark area, it's going to put a lot more dots all together. And if it's a white area, it's going to have almost no dots. And so you can come in here and you can pick any of these different dithering types, and when you click on each one of them, it'll show you a little preview of what it's going to look like. And then the other thing that you can do in here is called grayscale. And what grayscale does is it doesn't give you dots, but it just passes the laser back and forth, and then it just adjusts the laser power to how dark it needs to make that particular spot. So obviously when it's in the black, it's at 100% power, and when it goes to white, it goes to 0% power. Now this is a much more CPU processor intensive situation, so you can use it if you want, you know, especially for how small this is. It might be slightly overkill to do something like that. I know a lot of people like to use Jarvis, and then, you know, when you see some of those kind of pre-made images online, a lot of those are using something like halftone. So another way to kind of see all of this information, I'm gonna close this real quick, is if you select your image and then you right click and then you go to adjust image, this will show you a lot of those settings, but actually show you what it's going to do to the image. So on the left here we have our original image, and then on the right we have the dithering that we have selected. So again, I have this on halftone. If I was to set it to Jarvis and you zoom in, you can kind of see what it's doing here, and then you still have control over the line interval and the DPI here. You can also kind of adjust your brightness and your contrast and your gamma, and then also this enhance radius is kind of like it's kind of like an edge finder, where it'll start to enhance kind of the more important details and let the other details kind of fade to the back. So whatever you select here is the same thing as selecting stuff in the cuts and layers, or in that you know, double clicking on the cut settings for that layer. The thing I like to do about this, you know, adjust image is you do have control over the contrast and brightness, and you can see kind of what it's going to do to build up that image. So it's pretty useful. So that is one type of raster image, and once you have your power and your speed correct, and you know where your laser is in relation to that object, you can go and you can click frame. It'll frame around the object that you're trying to burn, and then when you're ready, you just click start, and it'll send it off to the machine. And that's really how you just do a regular raster image in Lightburn. Now, let's say we had a different type of raster image. So I'm going to import and I'm going to import my Buster Beagle 3D logo. So this is also just a regular raster image. So if I was to go and click on the preview, you'll see that it's just going to draw it from the bottom all the way up to the top, only making up the black areas. But let's say that I wanted to change this and I wanted to turn this into something where, you know, maybe I just want to cut an outline around this and then I want to cut out this circle. Well, what you can do is you can convert this raster image into a vector image. So if I select it and then I right click, and then underneath preview is trace image, I can click on trace image. It'll bring up this box. And what this is doing is finding the differences between kind of a black and white image. You know, if you tried to do this to a more like that Mount Rushmore image, it might have a harder time, but it works really well with, you know, straight black and white images. And then I can click OK. And so now you see I have another layer in here which has fill, line, and offset fill. And what that is going to allow me to do is pick any one of those settings when I'm using this layer. So if you see, I can move away that original image. So this was the original image that this was generated off of, and I can even delete it, and that'll go away. So I can start to fill in those images, but right now they're all on the same layer. So they're not separate pieces. But if I select this and I select the ungroup, so now you'll see that I have two different selections in here. So I have Buster and then I have the circle around him. And so let's say that I wanted to engrave Buster, but then I wanted to cut it out of something. So I can select my Buster, and I'm gonna apply a different layer to him. So if I select this 2, you'll see that he is now turned red, and I have a new layer for him in here. So if I select that, now this is set to a fill, and I have 3 different options. I have line, fill, and offset fill. So if I select fill, it's just going to fill the object in. I'm going to click preview. It's just going to fill the object in from the bottom to the top. If I was to select line, of course, it's just going to create a line around that dog. And then if I do offset fill, what that does is instead of just going from the bottom to the top, what it does is it fills it out from the middle to the outside. So it's just another way of kind of generating the file. Now the only reason that I could think that you might want to do this is when you do a regular laser, it just goes back and forth and back and forth. So you might start to see like a little bit of a jagged line as it's filling just from the top to the bottom. But with this offset fill, you're not going to have lines that just go back and forth, because by the time it gets to the very end, you're just tracing the entire contour of that object, which, you know, in some certain cases might give you a better result. I don't really use it, but I'm just showing you what it is and why it's there. And so the other thing that I wanted to bring up again on this is, let's say I wanted to cut out this line, but I wanted to fill Buster. And again, earlier in the video, I talked about how the order of operations in the cuts or layers, it'll always start with the first one and then go to the second one. So if my blue was the cut, it would cut it out first and then engrave. Well, I don't want to do that. I always want to engrave before I cut. So then I can just drag that up to the top, or again, I can use these arrow keys to move that. So now it will do the engraving first and then cut the line around. So let's say that you went onto Etsy and you found one of those nifty 3D images that they're all over the place, where you can burn an image onto wood and you want to know how to use it. Now, a lot of those will say for the Glowforge or something else like that, but you want to use it on your xTool D1. I'm going to import one of those right now. Okay, so this is just an image that I purchased off of Etsy that you can burn onto a cutting board or something like that. But if you depending on where you purchase this, if you zoom in, you can see that it's already been dithered. So they've already set this up in such a way where they're just expecting you to put it on the machine and just burn it. Now, you wouldn't want to go in and dither this again, or set an image setting for this again, because then you're doing it twice to the same image, and that's really not what you want to do. So if you have an image like this, what you would want to do is when you come into the cut settings, you want to change this to pass through. So right next to the image mode is pass through, and so that means that it's not going to run any type of calculation on that image. It's just going to burn it exactly how it is. And so again, that's only if it's already set up like that in the image that you purchase. Or let's say you generated your images outside of Lightburn in something like ImageR. It's another website where you can do this kind of thing. That's where you would just want to have this stuff and set it directly to pass through. Now, another little trick that I like to do when I'm doing stuff like this, in addition to the power speed test that I run on the the type of cutting board or whatever else I'm working on, is if I was to burn this, and I'm just going to pick some settings. I'm going to choose 7,000 millimeters per minute at 80% power. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to hit OK. Now, if I was going to burn this onto a cutting board that was this size, if I went in here to preview and I see what it's going to do, if you look here where it says the total time estimate, it's showing that this is 1 hour and 34 minutes. Now, I don't know if that's correct or if I have this set up correctly, but it's still 1 hour and 35 minutes to do the whole thing. Well, that's a long time to wait, and sometimes these take 3 or 4 hours to do something like this, depending on your settings. Well, I don't know that I want to wait that long just to see whether I've ruined a piece or not. So what I like to do is I like to take just a rectangle, and then I find a part that is important in this image that I want to do a little bit of a test on. So I'm gonna drag over just this little section of the bee right here. So then I'm going to select this little square, and I want to make sure that that square is set to line. And then I'm going to select the image, select the square, I'm going to right click, and then I'm going to apply mask to image. And what that's going to do is it's just going to crop a little section of that image that I'm working with. And then when I run my test, I'm going to just do a little version of an important area just to make sure that my settings are correct. Because I don't want to spend or waste a lot of time ruining a piece just to find out that I didn't do it correctly, or I didn't have the right settings, or I wanted it to be a little bit darker or a little bit lighter. So that's just a good way of testing just a small section. When you want to get rid of that, you can just remove the mask from the image, and then I'm just going to select that line again and delete it. And then you know that your settings are correct for that image that you bought and spent that money on Etsy. Alright, so moving right along. So the next thing that I want to go over is the Rotary tool. So if you have the Rotary tool, again, you want to set it up kind of how the company shows you how to do it, where you're going to raise your machine up, plug in your Rotary, you're going to unplug the Y-axis stepper motor, and you're going to plug your Rotary into it. This is the older Rotary. There is also the newer Rotary that has the chuck on it, but they both hook up pretty much the same way. So now we want to use that in Lightburn. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do is you want to come over to the settings and you want to show rotary enable on main window. So when you click on this and hit OK, it's now it's giving you this little enable rotary button in your laser controls. So this is how you would enable it or disable it. Now if you come over here to this little icon up here, this will open up your rotary setup. So if you're using the original D1 roller, you only have this roller setting. But if you're using the RA2 Pro, you also have a chuck setting. So I'm going to go over the roller setting first. First you would want to enable the rotary. It's doing the same thing as enabling the rotary down here. You want to make sure mirror output to rotary is turned off. And so the millimeters per rotation for the rotary is 32. The roller diameter, and that's the diameter of a single roller. And on this, the roller diameter is 17. And then down here for the object diameter and circumference, this is really for your own benefit. This doesn't change any of the settings in this rotary setup, but it's a good thing to kind of test. So let's say the object that I was working on, and I know the object diameter of that is 43. So what that's telling me is that my circumference, or the full length around the object that I'm working on, is 135. So the reason that's important is if I was putting something on a cylinder that was 43 millimeters in diameter, I would never want to put something on it over 135 millimeters, because then it would overlap. So it would engrave on the whole thing and then overlap on the other side. So it's just kind of a nice thing to know. And we also want to make sure that it's on the Z-axis, and then you can test it just to make sure that it's working. So I'm going to hit OK. And again, you see that it has enabled the rotary over here. So for this one, I'm just going to do just a quick test. Now, when you're using the rotary, you want to set it up in that way that I was showing before. So you wouldn't want everything in this axis. You actually want everything turned 90 degrees. So I'm going to select this test, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. Alright, so then you can pick the current position of where the laser is. So let's say I was starting, I'm going to start on the bottom here. So the laser will start at this position and then carve all the way until it finishes this test on the other side. And then when I click start, it'll say it might cut out of bounds, continue anyway. You just say yes, and then it'll go through and it will cut that test onto my cylinder. Now that is the way that just the regular rotaries work. Now if I was going to be using the chuck for this, I would want to select chuck and then obviously enable my rotary. But because the chuck is set up in a different way, so it's basically going to be rotating backwards, what you want to do is mirror your output to the rotary. So whenever you're using the chuck on the device, you want to mirror your output. And then for the chuck, it also has a different rotational value. So for this one, it's 128 millimeters per rotation. And on this one, you actually want to put in the diameter of the object that you're working on. So here I'm going to add 43, which is the diameter of the little test piece that I'm working this on. And then we'll hit OK. So now I'll run this test. But the other thing to keep in mind here is everything has now been mirrored. in the output. And that also kind of applies to the job origin. So I would suggest moving the job origin to the center, and when you move it to the center, and actually that brings up a point. If you see that the job origin doesn't look like it's respecting the current position. So when I click on these different corners, you'll see that it doesn't look like it corresponds to where it should be corresponding. So if I pick the center, well, why is it down here instead of here? And when you're using the chuck, it wants to think that your object is right in the center. So I'm going to change my Y position from the center to 200, which is right in the center of all of this. And so when I start to click these positions, now it's putting it right at the extents of where that model or where that image is supposed to be. Now the other thing again is it's been mirrored, so it's backwards. I would recommend putting it in the center and then lining up whatever it is that you're engraving on right in the center, and then you don't have to worry about this. But let's say you wanted to start at the bottom here and then go this way. Well, instead of picking the bottom origin point, you would actually pick the top one, and then it would start from here and go this direction. And inversely, if you want to do it the other way, you would pick the top one if you wanted it to start from here and go that way. I would highly recommend, before you commit your rotary to any object that you're trying to burn on, run a couple of tests on a toilet paper tube or something that you're not going to get upset if you damage it, until you fully understand exactly how your rotary works and what the orientation is. I can't tell you how many cups I've ruined, or mugs or something, where I didn't realize that I was burning in the wrong orientation. So just be sure to do something like a test before you commit this to your rotary. And when you want to go back to using the regular laser, you just want to make sure you disable this enable rotary and unplug the rotary tool and plug back in your Y-axis stepper motor. So that's really it. You know, there's obviously more things that this program can do, and you know, there's lots of videos that specifically go over different settings that you can do in Lightburn, but that should allow you to handle quite a lot of situations in here. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments below, and I'll try to answer them when I can. I also highly recommend that if you're using one of these tools, to join one of the xTool Facebook groups. Specifically for the D series. There's also kind of an owners group, more of an unofficial group, but there's tons of people in here more than happy to help. You know, there's a search in here where you can ask your different questions about Lightburn or other things, and you'll find tons of different things on that. So do feel free to kind of peruse around that. I would definitely suggest searching first and then asking second. But there's a wealth of information, and this has been around for quite a few months, so you'll probably find a lot of good information on there. So that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed this. If you do, please do hit that like button and consider subscribing for more videos like this on laser engraving, 3D printing, CNC, injection molding, and all things maker. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.